like random tourist passing through.
Right.
He was a British officer stationed in the region.
Oh, wow.
So he had firsthand experience with the people, the politics, the culture, all of it.
That's amazing. And knowing your interest in political conflicts and all the diverse cultural practices of places like Hunza, Nagar, and Baltistan, I really think you're going to find his observations so insightful.
Yeah, from what I've gathered, he really goes deep into like the power struggles between these communities, all their unique customs, even their forms of entertainment.
Oh, wow.
Like, for example, did you know they had a totally different calendar system?
Really? I'd love to hear more about that.
So imagine a year divided into like two halves, right?
Okay.
Starting at the winter solstice and then the summer solstice. And each half has the same month names, but they're in reverse order.
That's so strange.
It really makes you think about how time was like experienced in this region. Totally different from how we think about it.
Yeah, like stepping into an alternate reality or something. But okay, before we get into all those really cool details, let's set the scene. Like, geographically, what was the Hindoo Koosh like?
So Biddulph, he describes these towering mountains and deep valleys, like a landscape that both connected and isolated these different communities.
Yeah.
And he really emphasizes how this geography played this huge role in shaping the political landscape.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a region where it was very easy for communities to just be cut off from each other.
Exactly.
And maybe that leads to like a patchwork of cultures and political systems.
Exactly. And those differences often led to conflict. Biddulph gives tons of examples of invasions, power struggles, all these shifting alliances.
Wow. Okay, so how did this geographic isolation that you're talking about,
Yeah.
how did that show up in the cultures of Hunza, Nagar, and Baltistan? Like, did they develop unique customs?
Oh, absolutely. Biddulph describes this huge range of cultural practices.
Wow.
For instance, in Hunza and Nagar, he noticed this really strong warrior culture
Okay.
with all these rituals and ceremonies that basically reinforced the authority of the ruler, the thumb.
The thumb. Okay, so do you think this warrior culture was tied to, like, all the conflicts that you're talking about?
Most likely, yeah. Remember, these communities were always competing for resources and control.
Right.
So having this strong military tradition, it was essential for survival.
Made sense.
Yeah.
He also mentions this other unique practice in Hunza and Nagar.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to admit, this one's a little hard for me to understand. It's the custom of offering your wife to a guest as a sign of hospitality.
Yeah. It definitely challenges our modern sensibilities.
Right.
But it's important to remember that these customs, they had their own internal logic, their own meaning within their specific cultural context. Biddulph, he kind of suggests that it was rooted in this really deep sense of honor and hospitality, even if it seems really shocking to us as outsiders.
Yeah, it reminds us that we can't really judge the past by today's standards.
Exactly.
You have to try to understand these practices in the context of their own time and culture.
Exactly. And that's why Biddulph's observations are so valuable. He gives us this window into a world that was so different from our own. It challenges us to confront our own assumptions and really broaden our understanding of human behavior.
That's a good point. Okay, well, speaking of challenging assumptions, what about Baltistan?
Yes.
How did its culture and political structure differ from Hunza and Nagar?
Well, Baltistan had its own unique set of customs and traditions, for sure.
Okay.
Biddulph says they were ruled by the Makpons,
Makpons, okay.
and they seem to have had a more decentralized system than the thumbs of Hunza and Nagar.
So less absolute power for the ruler in Baltistan.
It seems that way. Biddulph describes the system where these local chiefs had a lot of influence.
Huh?
So it suggests a more collaborative approach to leadership.
That is quite a contrast to the more like centralized, almost authoritarian rule in Hunza and Nagar.
Yeah.
Do you think this difference in political structure had any impact on like how many conflicts there were?
It's possible a more decentralized system might have led to more internal disputes,
Okay.
but potentially fewer, like, huge wars with neighboring communities. Of
Well-
course, we'd have to look at the historical records to know for sure.
Right. It's just fascinating to see how these different political structures emerged in such close proximity. It really highlights the diversity of the Hindoo Koosh region,
Yeah,
even in like a relatively small area.
absolutely. And that diversity extended to their religious beliefs, too. So while Islam was the main religion in all three regions, it had all these different forms.
Didn't he mention that the Shiites were especially powerful in Gilgit at some point?
Yeah, he describes a period when the Shias in Gilgit were the dominant sect.
Wow.
And they even persecuted Sunnis who didn't want to convert. It shows how these religious dynamics, even within the same faith, can lead to conflict and power struggles.
Yeah, it's a reminder that religious tolerance, as we understand it today, it wasn't always the norm, even within communities that shared a common faith.
For sure.
Okay, so what about other cultural practices?
Right.
Were there any similarities across Hunza, Nagar, and Baltistan?
Biddulph observed that all three communities, they placed a really high value on kinship and community bonds.
Okay.
He describes these elaborate ceremonies and rituals that kind of reinforce those connections.
Like that ceremony that involved a visiting chief and a bullock.
Yes, the Koba ceremony. It was this dramatic display of hospitality and warrior prowess, with all this elaborate horsemanship and marksmanship.
That sounds almost theatrical.
It was quite a spectacle, according to Biddulph. And while it might seem weird or even barbaric to us now, it served a really important social function. It reinforced the social hierarchies, and it strengthened bonds between communities.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even rituals that seem aggressive can have a deeper meaning and purpose within their cultural context.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to approach these accounts with an open mind, Try to understand these practices from the perspective of the people who actually lived them.
Yeah, good point. Well, it seems like we've only just started to explore the political and cultural landscape of the Hindoo Koosh.
Oh, yeah. Just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack in Biddulph's account.
I bet. But for now, let's give our listener a moment to process all this amazing information. It's hard to even imagine a world where geography played such a huge role in shaping cultures and causing conflicts.
It really makes you appreciate the power of place in human history and all the different ways that societies have organized themselves over time. And that power of place, it goes beyond just the physical landscape, too. Remember how we were talking about the different calendar systems?
Yeah.
It just shows a fundamentally different way of experiencing time and the natural world.
It's amazing how something as basic as a calendar can show these huge cultural differences.
Absolutely.
So did Biddulph mention any other customs that might seem strange to us today?
Well, he did talk about the slave trade that was going on in certain areas, like Chitral and Yasin.
Okay.
And even by the standards back then, it was considered pretty brutal.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's tough to think about those darker parts of history,
Yeah.
even in places that seem so remote and isolated. Did he say anything about how this practice worked within their society?
He suggests it was driven by a few different things, like economic gain, obviously, but also political power plays, and sometimes even revenge. Sadly, he says, the beauty of the Chitral women made them really sought after in slave markets, like as far away as Kabul and Peshawar.
That's heartbreaking. To think of all the suffering those people went through, it makes you wonder how practices like that could exist alongside the strong community bonds and hospitality that we were talking about before.
It's a real paradox. But human societies, they're rarely simple.
Right.
They can have both great kindness and terrible cruelty all at the same time.
Yeah.
And Biddulph's writing, it makes us confront that complexity.
It really does. It makes you appreciate how far we've come in terms of human rights.
Right.
Even if we still have a long way to go. Okay, but let's shift gears a little. You mentioned that Biddulph saw this unique caste system in Dahanu.
Right.
It's a village in Baltistan, right?
Yes.
How did that system work?
What's interesting is that it seems to have flipped certain parts of the traditional Hindu caste hierarchy.
Okay.
So Biddulph said men from higher castes could marry women from lower castes, but not the other way around.
That's the opposite of what we normally think of when we hear about caste systems.
Yeah, it is. It really makes you think about where this system came from and how it evolved.
Did he have any thoughts on that, like how it came to be?
He didn't say too much about that, unfortunately, but it shows how systems like caste, even though they seem universal, can actually be really different depending on the culture.
That's a good point. Even practices that look the same on the surface can have totally different meanings underneath.
Okay, well, let's get back to politics for a minute.
Okay.
Biddulph talked about all these conflicts and power struggles. But did he give any examples of how these communities resolved disputes?
In Hunza and Nagar, the Thum had absolute authority.
Right.
So they were the ones who ultimately decided everything.
Okay.
But he does mention these officials called the Wazirs and the Taranfas,
Okay.
who acted as go-betweens for the ruler and the people.
Okay.
So they would often try to mediate disputes and uphold local customs. So even within a system where one person had all the power, There were still ways to address problems and keep things in order.
Exactly. It's different from how we think of power and authority today,
For sure.
but it worked in their society.
Did he see any similar ways of resolving conflict in Baltistan,
Yeah.
where the power was more spread out?
He doesn't give as much detail about their specific methods,
Okay.
but he does talk about the importance of local chiefs and councils. In mediating disputes and keeping things stable, it sounds like a system where power was more shared,
Okay.
and they had to negotiate and collaborate more to find solutions.
It's so interesting how the same basic human need to resolve conflict could play out so differently, depending on how power is structured. Did Biddulph say anything about the role of religion in all of this?
He did mention that religious differences sometimes made things worse between communities.
Right.
Like, he talks about conflicts between Sunni and Shia communities, particularly in Gilgit.
It just goes to show that even when people share the same religion, it doesn't always mean peace. Did he see any examples of religion bringing people together?
He did say that certain festivals and religious practices helped to unite communities, even if they had different beliefs.
Okay.
For instance, he describes this festival celebrating the wheat harvest, where everyone would get together and roast ears of corn. It was like a symbol of abundance and community.
So it sounds like religion, like a lot of things in life, could be both a source of conflict and a source of unity.
Precisely. Biddulph's account reminds us that human societies are rarely just one thing or the other.
Right.
They're complex and they're always changing.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have all these little pieces of information, and we're trying to figure out how they all fit together to understand what life was really like back then.
It's a challenge, but it's really rewarding.
Yeah.
And Biddulph's work gives us so many of those important pieces that help us to understand this amazing region.
Okay, well, speaking of complexity, you mentioned earlier that Biddulph had some interesting observations about the Balti people,
Oh, yes.
particularly about them possibly having Dard ancestry. Can you tell me more about that?
He noticed that the Balti people, while they mostly saw themselves as having Tartar heritage, they also seemed to have adopted some Dard customs. And that goes against the idea that they were new to the region.
So it suggests maybe a longer and a more complicated history of these groups mixing together.
Exactly. It seems like there was more interaction and exchange between them than people thought at the time.
Did he say how this blending of cultures happened?
He didn't get into specifics, but it was probably because of centuries of trade, migration, and people marrying from different groups.
It just shows how cultures are always changing.
Absolutely. They're not static, they're alive, and they're constantly evolving as people interact.
And the Balti people are a great example of that.
Yeah, with their mix of Tartar and Dard influences.
It seems like we've just started to uncover all the layers of history and culture in the Hindoo Koosh.
We have. And even though Biddulph's account has its limits, it still gives us this valuable glimpse into a world that was on the verge of huge changes.
Right.
A world where ancient traditions were bumping up against modern influences. And that was shaping the future of these communities.
It makes you wonder how they dealt with all those changes and how they're still adapting today.
It's a question worth exploring more deeply.
Definitely.
And hopefully this deep dive will encourage our listeners to learn more about the history and cultures of the Hindoo Koosh.
You know, it really makes you wonder what everyday life was like back then. For the people living in the Hindoo Koosh, did Biddulph talk about their routines at all? Or any of their traditions?
Oh, yeah, he did. He actually goes into a lot of detail about their customs, their beliefs, even their entertainment.
Okay.
For example, he noticed that polo was a really popular sport in Gilgit, Hunza, and Nagar. It was like a national pastime.
Wow. I can imagine those fierce warriors, all skilled horsemen, out there battling it out on the polo field. That must have been something to see. Did they play it differently back then?
Biddulph says they used a stick that was a bit curved and a wooden ball. And the rules were, they were a lot more relaxed than they are now. He even describes this unique version they played in Chitral. They called it Gal.
Gal.
And in Gal, the players try to hit a small ball into a hole in the ground.
Oh, wow. So even within the Hindoo Koosh, there were different ways of playing.
Exactly.
That's so cool. Did he talk about any other types of entertainment?
Well, in Badakhshan, the sport they loved was called Guskushi, and it was a lot more intense.
Intense how?
So picture this. It's this chaotic scrum of horsemen all fighting over the carcass of a goat.
Okay.
And they're all trying to carry it across a goal line. So it was a test of strength, horsemanship, and probably a lot of luck too.
Wow, that sounds crazy. It's interesting how their entertainment reflects their values.
Oh, right.
Like polo is all about skill and strategy.
Yeah,
And then you have buzkushi, which is just pure power and chaos.
exactly. And Biddulph doesn't just talk about the games. He also goes into their music, dance, and storytelling traditions. And he points out how those varied from place to place, showing how diverse the Hindoo Koosh region really was.
So even though these communities were close together geographically, they still had their own unique ways of expressing themselves. Did he give any examples?
He mentions the warlike songs of Gilgit, Hunsa, and Nagar. A lot of those were about the great deeds of past rulers and famous battles, but then the songs of the Kaur people in Chitral, those were more about love and longing. He describes them as more amorous and melodic.
It's like you can hear their history and their values in the music. That's really powerful. What about their religious beliefs? What did he observe about that?
He saw that while Islam was the main religion in the region, there were also a lot of pre-Islamic beliefs and customs that were still around.
Like that Daniel tradition we talked about before, where women would go into these trance-like states and give prophecies.
Yes, exactly. That's a perfect example of how older belief systems could exist right alongside the newer ones. He also tells this story about the now poor Buddha statue. It's near Gilgit.
Oh yeah, remind me about that.
So it's this giant statue of Buddha carved into the rock. But over time, the local legends changed, and it became a story about a demoness who was turned into stone by a holy man. It's a great example of how symbols and stories from older religions can be reinterpreted and become part of new belief systems.
It's like the past and the present are always influencing each other. Did he see any other examples of this kind of blending?
Yeah, he noticed it even in their burial customs. So in Daryl and Tangier, they would put carved wooden figures at the ends of graves. That's something you don't see anywhere else in the region.
Wow. Those little details really bring the past to life. It makes you think about the people who lived there centuries ago, but it also makes you wonder how those communities were affected by the arrival of Biddulph and other outsiders.
That's a really important point. Biddulph's account is interesting, but it's a product of its time. He was a British officer writing from a colonial perspective, so we have to remember that. There could be some biases and things he missed.
That's true. We always have to consider the author's background and perspective when we're looking at historical accounts. Did he talk at all about the influence of the British on the region?
He doesn't address it directly, no.
Okay.
But he does mention new technologies coming in, like matchlock guns, which were starting to replace their traditional weapons. And he also talks about the growing influence of Kashmir in the area, both politically and culturally.
So even back then, they were already starting to experience the effects of globalization
Yeah.
and the reach of empires. Makes you wonder how they dealt with all that change and how they've continued to adapt over the years.
That's definitely something worth exploring further.
For sure.
And hopefully, Biddulph's account will encourage people to learn more about how the Hindoo Koosh has changed and evolved.
Well, I think we can both agree that this deep dive into tribes of the Hindoo Koosh has been really eye-opening. We've learned so much about the unique cultures, the political systems, and even the ways people entertain themselves in this incredible region.
Absolutely.
We've seen how geography shaped their lives, how conflicts started and ended, and how ancient traditions survived alongside newer religious beliefs.
Right.
And I think the most important takeaway is that even in these seemingly remote and isolated parts of the world, human stories are always complex and fascinating.
Definitely. They're never simple.
And that's what makes history so interesting to explore. So, to our listeners, keep exploring. There are countless stories out there waiting to be discovered, each one offering a window into the vast tapestry of human experience.
I couldn't agree more.
And who knows? Maybe you'll be inspired to do your own deep dive into the history and cultures of this extraordinary region. Until next time.